Welcome to East Asia Pulse, a podcast series by the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. I'm Alfred Schipke, the director of the East Asian Institute, and I'll be your host today. We're very delighted to have Rana here today as our guest in Singapore. Rana is professor and chair in U.S.-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School, and his extensive research focuses on modern Chinese history and politics. He has also explored how China's evolving role on the world stage impacts China's relationships with Western powers and neighboring Asian countries. Welcome, Rana, and thank you very much for talking to us today.
Alfred, it's a huge pleasure to be here in Singapore and a huge pleasure to be here on The Pulse.
The timing of today's podcast could, of course, not be more propitious. We're merely days away from the inauguration of Donald Trump as the 47th president, a moment that will likely redefine U.S. engagement with the world. Against this backdrop, Europe finds itself in a particularly precautious position, grappling with its dual dependency on the United States and China. As Europe navigates this turbulent landscape, achieving strategic independence has emerged as a central goal of its industrial policy. But the reality of Europe's economic entanglements raises critical questions about how feasible that is. Europe's economic ties with both the US and China are profound. Thousands of European global companies have significant operations in these two major economies. Just to give you an example, Germany has some 6,000 companies, many of them generating their large share of profits in China. France has 2,000. These connections reflect Europe's reliance on global value chains and exposure to the policies and economic climates of both superpowers. This dual dependency complicates Europe's ability to position itself as an independent player. Rana, under these circumstances, how can Europe reconcile its economic dependencies with its aspiration for strategic independence?
Alfred, it's a great question. And let me start by doing the most evil thing that an interviewee can do, which is to turn the question back slightly on the interviewer and say, you use the term dual dependency. And we're going to talk about that because it is tremendously important, I think, to understand the ways in which Europe is finding itself rapidly in situations where business as usual can't continue. If we just for a moment redefine the dual dependency as dual opportunity, I think we can see some of the positives that European policymakers are going to have to grasp and take hold of to essentially use this particular very volatile, very turbulent moment in geopolitical and geoeconomic terms, to adapt a term that the, as we speak, current German Chancellor Olaf Scholz used a while ago in a very different context, the Zeitenwende, the idea of a complete shift in terms of the time and place we're in. I think that there is an economic Zeitenwende on the way as well. So when I say dual opportunity, let's remember two things before we dive into the question. One is that Europe, meaning the European Union, and also associated and linked parts of that wider continent, are still a tremendous economic opportunity for other hungry economies. China, of course, is a country which has a great deal that Europe needs. But China also needs developed markets into which to export. And there aren't that many of them in the world yet. Of course, we're going to talk about global economies emerging in the global south, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. But let's be honest, Europe is still going to be very valuable that way for a decade and more to come. And the other opportunity is also not to underestimate some of the specific areas where clearly Europe can really push hard if it wants to. Just to take one very specific case study, many people listening to the podcast will be aware that when we talk about Taiwan semiconductor chips, that is impossible to think about without the Dutch company SML as the lithographic partner to that particular enterprise. That's a very European innovation there. And linked to that, just one other thing. There's an old joke, but actually it's not so much of a joke, that America innovates, China imitates, Brussels regulates. Now, we can all say reasons why each of those needs to be picked apart. It's too simplistic. But actually, control over global norms and standards, particularly in an area like AI, in an area like social media. As the morning that we're speaking, we're hearing about the way in which Mark Zuckerberg and Meta are changing the way in which they deal with fact-checking online. That's one small example of a bigger phenomenon where Europe still has a say. So those bigger shifts should be seen in terms of Europe also having leverage. Now, having said that, let's very quickly look at the area where I think the greatest problem lies at the moment. And you and I suspect will dive into some of the detail of that in just a moment. Essentially, the European industrial model, which is largely, but by no means wholly, based on the German industrial model, is really beginning to creak at the edges in a significant way. This is not a secret. People have known about this for quite a while. But nonetheless, the point at which it's become feasible to essentially say business as usual has really begun to recede into the distance. And if we think about just one field, electric vehicles, it's clear that Europe has a short-term solution to this, a sticking plaster, you might say, which has been to essentially put tariffs on the import of Chinese electric vehicles into the European space. And that will hold the fort for just a little while. But the bigger question of how and whether Europe can develop an industrial strategy that means that it can become a globally competitive producer, either to its own market or to the world, of high-quality EVs. That's a microcosm of the bigger question that is currently facing European industrial strategy.
Starting out maybe with the last point that you're making, and you're being very specific because you're talking about the EV sector, and sometimes the specificity brings the message home very clearly. It is true that we are at an inflection point, or maybe it's even a quantum leap, or however you want to call it. But this is where Europe has significant disadvantages today. One could argue that Europe faces two shocks. One is the geopolitics, and the other one is technological. Either of those could happen almost independently. They're, of course, somewhat related. When it comes to the EV sector, Europe used to be a leader, in particular Germany, in the production of combustion engines. Every seventh job in Germany is more or less a function of the car industry. But it relied on a technology that has become obsolete. And the new technologies, that's not only EVs, it's also AI, autonomous driving, and whatever else you can come up with, requires two things. It requires huge amount of capital, and it requires huge amount of human capital. And in both areas, there are only two countries that have what it takes. One is the US with its venture capital and private capital, and of course a global talent pool that goes to the US. And you have China with state capital and also a large pool. Overcoming that is a structural issue. And it's not so clear that industrial policy itself can actually address that. So the question is, given these broader structural issues, what should Europe do in the short and the long term? You mentioned tariffs. That's, of course, a short-term reaction, buys you some time, but it doesn't really address the longer structural issues. So how would Europe address these things?
Look, that's exactly right, Alfred. The question of how things pan out in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years and beyond really has to be at the heart of that. I think it's worth remembering that, in a sense, Europe, the EU, is going through a process at the moment at which some of its core purpose is changing very fundamentally. To put it perhaps too simply, but usefully, over the last, 70, 75 years or so, essentially the primary purpose of the European communities, then becoming the European Union, was essentially to provide a means for very unrestricted free trade, movement of capital, movement of labor, movement of resources within the European market, culminating, of course, in the creation of the single market in the early 1990s. But, of course, with a barrier outside, the old line from many emerging economies being that it's very easy to sell within Europe, it's hard to sell into Europe. What Europe hasn't had to think about in quite the same way for decades is, first of all, the question of whether coordinated pan-European industrial strategy is actually a good idea. Because for a very long time, the tenor of the times in the social democratic and center-right world, particularly during the Cold War, was about the idea of freeing up markets and taking the hand of the state off industrial production. And in the era of the 1960s and 70s, when some countries like Germany did very well on that front, and others like the UK, perhaps not so much, managed to actually lose most of its automotive industry, for instance, we had mixed results at that time. The other element that even now has almost entirely been missing from that mixture is the geopolitical, because the question of defense and security and how that fits into a European story has essentially been taken off the table by NATO for a couple of generations, particularly during the Cold War, but even for the 25, 30 years that have followed the Cold War. That is no longer a separation which is plausible. What is there that might provide that solution that you were asking for in the question? I mean, the short answer, of course, is that one simple solution, as ever, is not going to be easy. But the following things are clearly on the agenda somewhere. The first one is to think about how far and how fast the partial integration of European markets in certain areas, particularly capital, really need to be progressed. It's been a long-standing issue that while the movement of goods is now pretty smooth, pretty straightforward within the European market, the movement of capital and the movement of services are still in a much earlier stage of development. And whatever happens with the next stage of the von der Leyen Commission and what happens beyond that, there is going to have to be much deeper consideration of that question. The second point is something that the Commission has started to do only within the last few years and pushed actually heavily by the COVID crisis, which is the active adoption of an industrial strategy. And if you look at documentation online, there's plenty of it there. The intention is very clear, even if the implementation is still partial. There is, of course, a huge amount of caution here that we all know about, which is that finding industrial strategy stories, even in very large markets that go well, is often hard to do. There's an old joke that governments are very bad at picking winners, but losers are really good at picking governments. And while the European Commission is not a government in the classic sense, it often sits in that kind of position. The final issue, and I think it's worth putting this on the table, is that really since the 2010s, but I think inevitably since 2022 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign European state, by Russia, it is no longer feasible to argue that European security is a secondary issue which can be wholly outsourced to the United States. That's separate from the imminent arrival of President Trump in his second term, who's made it very clear that he regards the necessity for Europe to do more for its own defense as a major part of his foreign policy strategy. Just in terms of industry, the question of how far defense capability and the production of materials that will be necessary as part of a situation where the situation with Russia, at the very least, whatever the outcome for a peace settlement for Ukraine, will be unstable. That is a conversation that has been very, very difficult to have. It is still very difficult to have, for instance, in the context of the upcoming German election. That'll probably be in a month or two as we speak here in Singapore in January. But it is a question that increasingly cannot be put to the side. And it is, as much as anything, a question of European industrial strategy and coordination.
I think when it comes to what needs to be done, I think you articulated clearly the creation of an integrated capital market. But what we see are that the politics of it is such that the likelihood that that will happen is relatively slim. Here we have a situation where an Italian bank wants to purchase a German bank. This is within the European Union, no foreign player, and it becomes a humongous contentious issue. The banking sector, Europe is still a bank-centric system. Talking about vested interest groups is probably not the part that will finance part of these new technologies, AI, which is more capital markets. But they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. So what would it take to come from the Draghi report, which I think in the end nicely summarizes what I think was very well known beforehand, what needs to be done in terms of regulation, in terms of creating an integrated capital market, in terms of human capital. But the politics seems to be such that overcoming it, you almost wonder whether it has to get worse in order to create a political dynamic that would allow these changes to take place.
You talked there, Alfred, about a variety of vested interests in Europe that want to keep the status quo. And I suppose the immediate answer I'd give you is, what if the status quo isn't there anymore in a very short period of time? Many of the assumptions that it's been perfectly safe to make about European markets, about the speed of integration, the way in which things have gone, even 10 years ago, are simply not certain in that sort of way anymore. As an academic, I can sit here essentially putting forward solutions and know I'm not going to have to be the one who gets voted in to implement them. But having said that, I think that there is a great deal to be said for the idea that you look out for crises and try and anticipate them before they happen. Now, the other golden rule, sadly, of geopolitics is that actually it's all very well to say that, but in practice it's often a crisis that actually forces people to act in certain ways. Nonetheless, there are certain things that I think are obvious now and certainly can be regarded as genuinely a crisis situation. Right now, for the reasons that you gave, the fact that capital can be mobilized and utilized in the United States and in the kind of wider Chinese space. And by the way, don't forget that Hong Kong, as a place that has very deep pools of capital, sits just across from one of the world's great ecologies for innovation, Shenzhen, a city that didn't exist 50 years ago. Now it is one of the 3 or 4 major, not just ecologies for AI and tech innovation in China, but actually globally as well. So that kind of integrated situation, which also see in Silicon Valley, that kind of geographical hub, Europe needs to think very carefully about how it's going to do that. It needs to think quite fast as well. I would say that the elements are clearly there. Europe still has one of the best educated populations in the world. It has labor mobility within the single market, which allows the capacity for people to move with relative ease and relative lack of friction. And it has lots of institutions which sit in the top tier in a broad sense in terms of innovation, although I think it is very worrying for Europe as a whole that when we think about the most innovative academic institutions in the world, of course, the huge numbers of the United States, that's been the case, it'll be the case for a long time to come, I suspect. More and more of them are in East Asia, including, of course, here in Singapore, where we're speaking right now. Not enough of them are in the European space, and quite a few that are in Europe broadly are actually in the UK, which, of course, now sits outside the EU. So all of those issues point to essentially a jigsaw puzzle. The pieces are there, they can be put together, but they are going to demand a significant amount of coordination to make that happen. And I think the really key issue is how do you get that past democratic publics? Because one of the things we've seen in voting patterns within the EU in the last 2, 3, 4 years, and there's no sign it's going to slow down, is people voting for parties that are much more skeptical about the European project, much more determined that a national story is really the way forward. That will happen perhaps to some extent in Germany. You can see it happening in France, happening elsewhere on the continent. That doesn't mean that the European project is finished by any means, very long way from it. But it does mean that thinking about how it coordinates with the real aspirations of actual voting publics in Europe, that is a key political task that is still very much putting some of the Brussels-oriented thinkers on the back foot. They need to be on the front foot.
Coming back to this issue about labor markets, and you highlighted, I think, correctly that Europe produces engineers, scientists. It just turns out that it produces the wrong engineers and the wrong scientists. There are stories that when there are joint ventures between European and foreign companies, and more European companies realize in order to remain competitive globally, they won't be able to fix it locally. They have to look for partners. The 2 partners that they have is US companies. Volkswagen, for example, has a joint venture with Rivian, or increasingly also Chinese companies. So Volkswagen has joint ventures with a number of Chinese companies. As part of this project, what becomes clear is that Europe has research staff that it brings to either side. These are mechanical engineers. And the US brings IT experts, and they don't even speak the same language because they're focusing on very difficult technologies. So even in these areas, there's like a shortness. So the question is a little bit, given that it will take time to move people from one field to another, it will probably happen over time, isn't part of the solution that Europe should recognize that it has to collaborate with other countries, and maybe more so with China in, of course, areas that do not immediately fall under the category of national security. I think, as you indicated correctly, that will be more on the front burner going forward. But it might be the only way for some of the companies to remain competitive globally by moving part of their research and development into either the US or China? Or is that inconsistent with coming back to maintaining that strategic independence?
It is one of those questions, Alfred, which is both urgent and in some ways it's kind of a quantum question as well, because the answer to it varies, depends whether you're looking at one part of the problem or another at any particular time. And I think part of the answer, perhaps surprisingly, comes from where we're sitting right now, which is Singapore, a place that is, obviously infinitesimally smaller than Europe as a whole, but actually in some ways has faced some of the similar problems, which is very well-educated population, some of the skills and expertise in the right places, others needing to shift, and very much caught between different ecologies, a security arrangement with the United States and also a long-standing connection with the United States in terms of education, culture, geopolitics, and so forth, but also a society which has very long-standing cultural connections with China and political connections with China today as well. I've noted when I've been driving downtown in the back of a taxi that you can head past a skyscraper, see it's the local Singapore headquarters of Microsoft. You turn a corner and you're driving past the headquarters of ByteDance, one of the big Chinese IT companies, and keeping those two ecologies going. And I think for the moment, sustainably, is something that Singapore has proved rather skilled at. So the question of whether or not a relatively small, quite shrewd, nimble country could be an example to the much bigger behemoth, you might say, of the European Union, I think is a moot question on that front. In terms of the central part of your question about where to play your chips, if you'll excuse the pun for a moment there, the casino or the semiconductor chip, depending which type you want to have. First of all, it seems to me, we're speaking now 10 days before Donald Trump is inaugurated as President of the United States again. If you get past rhetoric and surface noise for a moment, it does seem that there is one central geoeconomic proposition, aside from tariffs as well, I mean, that's obviously now well known, but a different geoeconomic proposition that the United States seems to be putting forward. And again, I would look to Scott Bessel at the Treasury to see whether this actually comes off, which is the idea that from around the world, including actually from China in some senses, but certainly from Europe, as much investment as possible should come into the borders of the United States. Big sucking sound of global capital coming into America. That's what President Trump wants. That's what his team wants. And I think actually they are going to push very hard on the argument that both the domestic economics of the United States, which wants all that capital coming in, and the security proposition that the United States makes to the liberal world, to Europe, East Asia, wherever it might be, are going to be tied together in a bargain of a sort that hasn't been seen before. So I wouldn't bet against the idea within the next 12 to 24 months that actually Europe as a whole is made a proposition by the United States that putting much more of that R&D capacity into the US actually is the price to pay. Now, does that exclude China? No, of course not, because one of the things we know is that in a growth scenario, assuming we get one, then the supply of capital is not finite. In other words, capital can grow as well, and you can place yourself in the Chinese environment also. China will do, I think, a great deal to try and make it attractive for that capital to come into China. Note, I say capital, not labor. I think that there is still a great reluctance to have too many foreign experts, engineers, or whatever, actually involved in the Chinese ecology. Some of it is actually just to do with the fact, as you'd expect, the vast majority of discussions about Chinese scientific progress in China are taking place in Chinese, and the number of foreign engineers who have both fluent enough Chinese and are able to navigate that very different environment in an authoritarian state is a very small number of people. So the market for that is quite small. But separate from that, there is nothing to stop dumb capital, as you might put it, coming into China, other than any decision from the United States that actually it must not go there. Going back to something I was saying earlier, I think that the conversation, which is already incipient, it's already starting off in Europe, needs to go further about what is it that Europe wants and where are its red lines? If its decision about where it deploys capital, where it deploys labor, where it puts in extra capacity to retrain people who are more versant in AI or the other areas that Europe is going to need more of and away from mechanical engineering, those decisions should be made now rather than in the middle of a geopolitical storm where the United States and China are both pushing Europe very hard in directions which are mutually incompatible.
You mentioned capital moving to the United States, and of course that's already reflected in the numbers. And you also mentioned that Europe, to shift R&D and other operations to China, might have constraints on many dimensions. But there's another interesting phenomenon that is reflected in the data, and that is increasingly you have more Chinese foreign direct investment or ODI going to other parts of the world. It actually is taking off. And it seems that the leadership in China is actually encouraging Chinese companies to go abroad, to establish joint ventures. Trump at some point even indicated that we might be willing to accept Chinese investments if they want to set up factories in the United States, creates jobs. Should Europe be willing to encourage more investments coming to Europe from China?
I think that capital flow from China will be coming for a while. And while it's available, Europe should be thinking hard about where there are areas where it might well be useful to have it, and areas where it probably does go strongly across national security lines that can't be breached. To give one quick example of an area where at least there might well be potential, green energy transition. Already it's well known that solar panels are a technology that is pretty much dominated by China, and whether or not that's going to change that much in the near future is unclear. But the next generation beyond that is something where there's still a lot of space up for grabs, and Europe should be thinking hard about how it can get into that space, possibly with the addition of Chinese investment, if again the security implications can be overcome. But I think it's worth noting also that China is not undertaking the kind of FDI strategy that you've mentioned out of altruism or the goodness of its heart. A lot of secular changes, long-term changes, are beginning to really shift the way in which China can usefully use its own capital. The amount of credit that was created in the aftermath of the great financial crisis of 15 years ago has probably come to a halt. It's now well known the property sector has gone flat, collapsing in parts. It'll be bailed out by the party state, but the possibility of the property market being the source of a new boom in China is pretty close to zero. Beyond that, the bigger changes, such as demographic shifts, that essentially mean that China is having to move towards the costs and burdens of a society which is not only shrinking over time, but it is shrinking, but also is becoming older, really just beginning to be realized. Those societies need more healthcare. They need more elder care. They need more, to give an example of an area where Europe has an interest, more investment in pharmaceuticals that deal with issues such as dementia, Alzheimer's, depression. These are things that are already beginning to be noticed in China. And as a result, all of that unallocated capital is having to find new homes for more profitable investment. And actually the region is proving an important element of that strategy. It's well known that the, in some ways, rather tentative efforts by some Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia would be an example of that, to create automotive EV sectors of their own, are pretty much underpinned by Chinese capital and Chinese IP and technology now, and that path dependency is already set. They're also mostly, I think, underpinned by Huawei, ZTE, and other Chinese cyber tech, which of course creates its own dependency. Now, this can be seen and should be seen as an area where China is gaining greater geoeconomic and technological influence. That is, of course, one correct way to see it. The other way is to point out that it also creates dependency for China. China, if it were to put itself in a situation where essentially it gets itself through provocation or whatever into a dispute over the South China Sea or over Taiwan, will actually find that not only does it destroy or significantly damage its own economic links to the region, but also really damages confidence in terms of what kind of partner China is likely to be. I have an article actually that's coming out in the next edition of the Journal of Foreign Affairs, which is dealing with this question about if China does not choose to get into a conflict, and I think that it's not likely that it will, actually what opportunities does that give China economically? And I think that all of those opportunities are there, but they are the products of a society in the shape of China, which is changing in terms of its basic social and economic makeup quite significantly, and which can, I suspect, not really fulfill some of the wider nationalistic goals that its rhetoric keeps putting forward, the idea that it wants to do, simply because it would undermine its own economic model.
That brings me to another part, and that is the UK. Because I think the UK faces its own set of challenges. Maybe in a certain way, they're actually ahead of the European Union. On the one hand, post-Brexit, it is more distant from Europe. And now, in the context of a new administration in the United States, maybe its special relationship might also be weakened. Given these shifting dynamics, is the relationship with China even more challenging? Or are there also opportunities for the UK to engage with China, managing both the security concerns and the economic opportunities?
So I should confess my biases here. As people listening to the podcast can tell, I am British born and bred, and therefore, obviously, I have my own views on this question from a personal point of view. But let me try and stick to the geopolitics. Let me put a provocation before you, if I may, Alfred, which is this. From the point of view of the EU, leave aside the Brits for a moment, but from the point of view of the EU, at a time of increasing dangerous geopolitical and geoeconomic turmoil, having a large, or at least significant, medium-sized, open trading, liberal economy with a social democratic government, relatively stable politics, sitting 20 miles to the northwest of the continent, and essentially having only marginal engagement with it, is in the next 3, 5, 10, 15 years an unwise move. Britain needs friends and allies, but the European Union also needs to pick low-hanging fruit. And reworking the relationship with the UK and working out actually how natural allies and partners, maybe no longer in the same economic grouping, but nonetheless physically, inevitably close to each other, and with a closeness of mind and worldview, can work together. I think the choice about doing that is going to become much more urgent in the next few years anyway. So again, as with many things I've said in this podcast, it's best to be thinking about it now at a time when there's a little space to breathe. Of course, the argument would come, I've heard it many times myself, from the European Commission and others, that once you leave the club, you leave the club. You can't just keep coming back and borrowing the facilities. But I think that misunderstands, at some level, the nature of what the major European debates and priorities are going to be in the next 10 years or so. Of course, the single market is important. And of course, the UK, I'm sure, is not going to be in a position to have full access in the normal way to the market because of having left. Brexit is real and that has to be acknowledged. But let's look for a moment at the medium to long-term capabilities that the UK has that I think are not so easily matched in the EU at the moment and which will be essential. Take a look online at one of the great tools of assessments on AI. One of the areas which is clearly going to be essential to whatever happens to us all in the globe in the next 10, 15 years. None of us know what on earth is going to happen with AI, but we all know it's going to be important. If you look at the Tortoise Media Global AI Index, just Google it and it's right there, free access online, wonderful resource. The United States and China sit right at the top of the tree when it comes to AI innovation and capacity. No surprises there. And a couple of European countries, Germany and France, are definitely in the top 10 as well. Singapore actually scores quite high as well. But the UK is actually still very much in the forefront. It may not be there forever and ever, but right now it remains an immense innovator in an area of huge importance to Europe. The US doesn't need UK AI. China certainly doesn't need UK AI. Europe, I think, does. Or let's take one other area, which is central to the UK's global proposition, which is the City of London. Now, once the City of London has exited the European Union, the European financial sphere, obviously it's going to be treated, has been treated in a different way from when the UK was inside the EU. And yet its central power, its central importance, the ability to essentially attract very deep pools of capital, is something that Europe can still find valuable. If the argument is about everything must be done within Europe itself only, then trying to build up French and German pools of capital for innovation quite there. We talked earlier about venture capital and Europe's deficits on this. The UK is not the solution to that, but it clearly could be part of the solution if you have the right sort of conversations. One final example, which again relates to where we're sitting right now in Southeast Asia. CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is an oddity, and yet a very important oddity in terms of international trade agreements. It's the only trade agreement for the moment in Asia that doesn't really include China as a player. China wants to get in, not getting in at the moment. It does include the UK, which of course sits for a Pacific Pact, rather bizarrely in the position of being the second biggest country by GDP after Japan within the grouping. But the CPTPP is something the UK can join as a non-EU actor, and the EU as a whole could join perhaps, or at least have an association with, but in the end would have more difficulty dealing with. So having a friendly, liberal European state that can act as a bridge and a partner in that particular grouping, I think has huge importance. Why might that be important for the EU? Let's go back to that line we had earlier about Brussels regulates. The CPTPP is not, I think, frankly, that crucial in terms of goods trading, and certainly not from the point of view of the EU. The CPTPP, frankly, is not that important in terms of goods, at least as far as the UK is concerned. But one of the many things that it's looking to influence in the next decade or so is digital norms. That could be of immense importance in a world where the number of norm setters is shrinking and shrinking. Of course, the EU will continue to have a hugely important role on that. But in the East Asian space, China will still continue to be a very important player for obvious reasons, particularly since it's so central in infrastructure. And being part of an Asia-Pacific conversation from the inside, even with a European actor that is not part of your core grouping, may be the kind of slick and flexible diplomacy that is needed in some very changeable times in the near future. So I think there are plenty of roles for the UK, and the UK has to step up and actually show willing on this as well. It can't just sit on the back seat. But there needs to be a sense that both sides are having a serious conversation with each other, and that isn't quite as clear at the moment as it really needs to be. And it's worth Europe remembering that the 2020s and 2030s are going to see a lot more confluence between industrial strategy, defense strategy, and the capacity to produce against security threats, of which Russia is probably the most obvious one. In that conversation, the UK clearly has a role and a really active conversation that needs to be had with the EU.
Rana, this has been very interesting discussion. Maybe some of my takeaways, it makes a lot of sense for the UK and Europe to find areas to collaborate, which allows them to position themselves globally, taking advantage of each side's comparative advantage. I think you also highlighted that separating national security from economic interest, that paradigm is basically destroyed. So more effort has to be made in identifying areas that are somewhat not directly interfering with the national security component. Interestingly enough, given that we're here in Singapore, you're almost saying maybe Europe should be looking at some of the things that Singapore is doing. It is, of course, a little bit easier here because you have the government, the business community, and the country overall basically moving in lockstep. The problem is that we have different interest groups, different countries have different priorities. But what you're arguing is Europe should take advantage of the current environment, which is not a crisis environment, to address some of the issues. And I think you were hypothesizing that as it relates to capital, a lot of capital ultimately will be going to the United States. There might be opportunities for cooperation with China, but maybe that will be more limited. With that, I would like to thank you, Rana, very much for joining us. Once again, I'm Alfred Schipke here at the East Asian Institute in Singapore, and you have been listening to the East Asian Pulse. To learn more about our work and stay connected, you can subscribe to our mailing list on our webpage or follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. Thanks for listening to us, and until the next time, goodbye.